Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian and Aethers, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, we're going to be talking about a phenomenon that existed throughout the Renaissance period of Western esotericism that I think is really relevant to modern practitioners and is a pretty good way of dividing magic into different categories. And that would be a distinction that was incredibly popular at this time and was broadly accepted of magic into sort of three types of magic. Now, we often want to divide things into types of magic today. And often I think the ways that people divide magic into subtypes are very, very faulty. Specifically in the West now, we're really into the idea of the left hand versus the right hand path. This distinction originated in Hinduism, with the left-hand path of Hinduism, or Tantra, having a sort of idea within it called Vamakara. This is the first term of left-hand path. And then this was accepted into the West later on and sort of backwardsly applied to the magical traditions of the West. And in a way that kind of doesn't really make sense, right? Left-hand path kind of just means whatever is edgier than me or whatever is darker. But that's not a great way to categorize things. So I think a much better way is to look to our past, to look to the Renaissance, and see the three categories. Yes, I said three, not two. It was not just white magic and black magic. It was three categories, and what those categories mean. Those categories were as follows: Goetia, Theurgy, and Magia naturalis, or natural magic. In English, that would be Goetia, Theurgy, and natural magic. And these three ideas operate on very different frameworks and really do sum up the main types of magic that we see. The first category of magic is Goetia, and I think a lot of people are going to have heard this word before, specifically in reference to the Ars Goetia, one of the books within the Keys of Solomon, which is one of the most famous magical texts really in all of history. But it does largely come from this period. During this period, the grimoire tradition, as we call it now, was really what was going on, right? There were a lot of great grimoires being made. The Notoria, the Arbatel, all these things were coming from this era. And Goetia at this time was essentially a term that referred to a category of magic that would be ideas like witchcraft, and I mean witchcraft in the historic sense. Nowadays, witch has kind of started meaning any magical practitioner, right? But historically, that's not what witch meant. A witch was a specific thing. Any sort of magic done upon other people to cause them harm would fall in this category. Most things that in the East would be considered sorcery, as in the East, there's kind of a division there too, with mysticism, or Sufism versus sorcery or sahir being their big divide, but it would be things in that camp, right? I think specifically of one term that was used in the Bible in one of the translations that is brought up a lot, beneficia. So beneficia is the term that is used to refer to witch, but beneficia does not directly translate to witch. It translates to poisoner, and it represents how within this framework that the historic witch operated under, there was sort of this idea that bane and blessing are on the same branch and that it was okay to use things like poisons to get what you do. As well, practices like necromancy broadly fall into the Goetia category. Interestingly, if you look at the religious texts of history, and specifically when we're talking about this period, we are talking about a Christian period, but I will want to stress that the people who used these terms and engaged these practices were largely Neoplatonist. Neoplatonism is an evolution of Platonism, and Platonism, as we know, originated in Hellenistic Greece. But when Christianity came, Platonism was syncretized into Christianity and shaped a lot of Christian esotericism, being one of the ways that paganism in Europe kind of continued after the conversion. And in the pagan world, there was this same kind of distinction, right? There was this idea of magic that was mystical and magic that was not for the best thing. And that kind of follows into this idea. Now, necromancy is one of the few types of magic that is pretty universally banned in religious texts, though you do see certain saints or figures doing miracles related to necromancy. But what the interesting distinction is that these texts will make is necromancy with the aid of the divine, with God, with the ultimate good, is fundamentally different than necromancy done sheerly with the power of the self. It raises this kind of question of, do you get your power from the divine or from some form of the self? that being the divided line on what is good and what is bad. Now, divination often gets thrown into this category, with a lot of Christians considering divination to be very prohibited. But divination at this time was, funnily enough, not in this category. It was in the last category, natural magic. So now I would like to move to the second category, Theurgia or Theurgy. So this term does have a Neoplatonic root to it, and what it means is divine magic. So what's the difference between Goetia, as I just discussed, and divine magic? So a way that I like to explain this is actually using an example that came far later from Aleister Crowley, the Victorian occultist that sort of shaped modern Western occultism. And interestingly, in his book Liber ABA, that big blue brick, there is one specific essay that he calls the Formula of Witchcraft, which he argues is a formula of illusions, of moving things around on their surface and not calling on anything divine. Modern witches find that a very strange explanation, because that's largely not what modern witch practices like Wicca do. In fact, a lot of what modern witchcraft practices do would, funnily enough, fall into these later two categories. So what do people who call themselves Theurgists believe? So Theurgists are very much mystics, right? Their whole thing is about getting close to God. Specifically, they have a term called henosis, or unification with the one. So while this idea does predate Christianity, it would be a paganism that would be deeply Neoplatonic. Thus, it would be a paganism that verges into monism, or the belief that everything is one. So monism, yes, you will see people talking about multiple gods, but fundamentally they believe those gods all come back to one. This is very similar to emanationism, an idea that underlies most modern Hermetic ideas. As we know, Hermeticism is largely inspired by Platonism. And this is the belief that everything emanates from one point in the circle, a fundamental oneness, a unity. And then from that, it goes through various shapes and forms and gets to the material world. These emanations being the various gods and the subsequent spirits below it, which is a strictly hierarchical view of a cosmology. So Theurgia is calling upon God to get close to God and to annihilate the self. But what's interesting is I have used the word annihilation to refer to this type of idea, and a lot of people have found that an interesting take, because when we talk about annihilation into God, things tend to get very Christian, specifically the idea of theosis, which Orthodox Christian mystics heavily use, which, funnily enough, Orthodox Christian mystics have a very strong Theurgia influence on them, even though they would deny it. You'll see some Christians today say that Renaissance occultism, the grimoires, that whole period, were Christian heretics, right? They were not true Christians. But what's funny is true Christian mysticism, good Christian mysticism, still pulls from that. And so what theosis is annihilating the self to fully merge with God. But is that really different from henosis? I would say not really. But what happens is this raises a funny question. Is unifying with God, becoming one with the Godhood, essentially taking on godness, any different from annihilating the self entirely if we are talking about merging with God? And it reminds me of a Sufi thing that I read. One of the Sufis, the famous Islamic mystics, wrote that the statement, "I am God," is actually not a statement of declaring yourself God in this kind of modern way, right? We have this postmodern occult idea that you can do this thing called apotheosis, which is essentially go through a magical process and become a god yourself and have the power of a god. Really, the only religion besides these really modern left-hand path occult systems that argues this is Mormonism. Mormonism has this belief. But in everything else, when one says, "I am God," you are actually saying that you have fully emerged with God. You have annihilated yourself, and through annihilation, you take on the godhood itself, right? It is not a apotheosis or annihilation. In fact, the true apotheosis, the henosis, is this unification. And that is the ultimate goal of Theurgy. Now, I would like to move to the final category of magic, and this category actually encompasses a lot more than you would think. Magia naturalis, or natural magic. People hear natural magic, they think of nature, and what immediately is going to come to their mind is herbalism, and that is actually part of it, but that is not all of it. So natural magic encompasses really anything that involves forces beyond God itself. That would be land spirits, and that would be anything that uses some sort of material. So when you're doing Theurgy, there aren't a lot of materials you're using, right? You're basically just, praying to whatever, right? It's a lot of that. It's a lot of prayer. Inflame yourself in prayer, as some occultists will say. But in natural magic, you're using materials to transcend spiritually through them. And so within religions that believe in natural magic, there is a fundamental animism underlying it. I believe that animism is one of the few things that has transcended religious history. I don't think there's a single religion that actually denies animism or the belief that there is a spiritual nature within all things, right? Fundamentally, any religion that believes that the world was created by something and that creation retains an essence of what it was created by does agree with animism on some level. Now, other things that fall under natural magic would be ideas like alchemy. So alchemy was considered natural magic, which I think would really surprise people because nowadays most alchemical practices are focused on spiritual alchemy, or the merging of the things together to make the self better, a sort of purification. In the East, in Sufism, we see the idea of the purification of the heart, which is one of the key goals of the Sufi mysteries. It's to essentially get closer and closer to, as they would use the term Allah, to purify the soul and purify the heart, as they believe that God sits in the heart, to become a sort of better person. And in the West, we have this idea of the alchemical transmutation of the soul. And interestingly, a lot of this comes from the idea of humor. So humors is an idea that really underlied a lot of early medicine. As we say, mysticism led to medicine, and the separation of the sciences and the magical is perhaps not a great thing. Though I will grant that humors are not largely used in the medical field today, the idea of humors underlies natural magic. And basically, there are sort of different portions within the self, and to heal the self, to make the self better, to grow, to ascend, to get somewhere higher, you have to sort of balance these things out. So you can divide the humors into a number of things, specifically into the elements, earth, air, water, fire. So we know that the elements appear all over mysticism, and actually the elements transcend Western ideas. There's actually a whole elemental system in the East, right? China and the Far East have their own elemental system. They add things like wood, so their elements are a little different, but it is a lot of the same ideas. And then if we look to the Vedic traditions and the Indian subcontinent, you will see the doshas. So the doshas are a sort of composition of the self, and they are used very heavily in Ayurvedic medicine, which is based around these same kind of ideas, right? They believe that every person has a dominant dosha, and to heal the self, to be healthy, you need to balance out the other doshas, right? Also, if you look to planetary magic, you will see the same idea in any idea of astrological remediation. So astrological remediation is a way to approach astrology where you are actually interfacing with it, right? So let's say you're going through a really hard transit. Like right now when I'm recording this, Venus is in retrograde, and perhaps that's why my bangs are really not behaving today. Maybe that was a little bit of Venus remediation I just did there, right? To deal with the difficult transit, you will sort of call on the astrological energy that you are struggling with or lacking. So I would pray to Venus or do something Venusian, like fix my hair or do some self-care or go to the ocean, right? To remediate that and to balance that. And interestingly, astrology does fall under natural magic, which people will find strange. It's like, oh, isn't this about like plants and things? No, because space is part of the natural world itself. Now, there are multiple arguments for why astrology works, and you're gonna see kind of the people who practice natural magic astrology during this time giving different arguments. And that also relates to the broader discussion that people were having at this time of, is astrology good to do? You're gonna see very different answers on this, but what's interesting is most of the Renaissance mystics actually believe that astrology can be completely, compatible with their religious beliefs. There's a number of different arguments they made for this. I think the one that I find interesting, because it is so heterodox to the way people often think about astrology, was made by Arab philosopher Al-Kindi, who became the father of Arab philosophy. He's often called that. And he wrote a treatise on astrology called On the Celestial Rays, where he argued that astrology was completely compatible with his religion because he believed that Allah created the planets and the planets affected the earth because Allah gave them the power to do that. And so similar types of arguments kind of underlie the natural magicians of this time. So that's all something to keep in mind. Natural magic, while it does approach different things, whether it's plants or planets or what, it kind of has similar ideas to it. And what's interesting about the natural magicians is the natural magicians believed that they were given this power from the divine, right? And so that's why I think the term beneficia, as I mentioned earlier, is so fascinating, right? Beneficia referred to the prohibited witchcraft. And what made beneficia beneficia? Poison, right? It did not say plants, it said poison. And so what's interesting is you had historically this kind of strange back and forth between the people who thought they were doing good natural magic and Goetia, or as most people who were doing Goetia did not think they were doing Goetia, right? While I said there are these three kind of categories, while there were some practices that were generally agreed upon to be in one category, say necromancy, within these actual categories of people, you had a lot of debate on where the line is, right? Still today you do. I think a text that I've talked about that's very polarizing is the Shams al-Marif. The Shams al-Marif is an Islamic grimoire that came actually around, more or less around this time. General same time zone, kind of, a little bit off, but you know what I mean, like same, long time ago, right? Long time ago, but not too long, you know? And the people who wrote that book believed that they were Sufis, they were proper mystics. But largely the critique of that book has been is that it is actually sorcery. And so what's so interesting about the Renaissance magicians is often the grimoires, when they weren't doing Goetia, you will see modern Christians turn and claim that it is prohibited. Specifically, a lot of things that were happening in the Theurgy grimoires was the use of angels, right? Calling on angels. And following the Protestant Reformation, which is when Europe went Protestant and abandoned Catholicism and Orthodoxy, well, parts of Europe, obviously some of Europe is Catholic and some is Orthodox, but Western Europe largely went Protestant. I live in the US, I live in a Protestant culture, so sorry for being a bit more generalizing with that. You will see this idea of calling on angels being banned, right? Suddenly that's not okay, whereas in these grimoires, these people thought they were doing stuff that is fully upright. A grimoire from this period that's a little later, but still one that people talk about, Abramelin, right? The Book of Abramelin the Mage. That is largely Theurgia. In fact, the rituals within it are mostly just praying. But some people will still not call it that because of how direct it interacts with the divine. Because what's funny is no matter what magic category you're in, we're all seeking to interact directly with the divine rather than having a mediator or someone sort of step in our way, right? That's kind of what distinguishes it. And so I find it so interesting, hey, how we always are going back and forth on like what is in what category. So one question that I think this raises is, do you have to pick a category, right? Can you do more than one of these things? And I say yes. I think that historically, largely, people have done more than one of these things. You will see some people who claim that all they ever did was Theurgy, right? But the lines are so kind of close that they merge a lot, specifically between Theurgy and natural magic, because an interesting break off of Theurgy is the practice of thaumaturgy, which is kind of the other side of Theurgy, and this is practical magic. So thaumaturgy is basically using God to get practical results. How does this distinguish itself from any other forms of results magic or magic to make change in the material world? Well, the distinction is that it is calling on God and the highest good to do the thing, rather than just doing the things using the pure will of the self. So that itself, right, that can become a debated topic. And I find it so interesting where these lines fall and the complexity of what falls where. I think as practitioners, you know, probably we're going to want to be thinking we're doing Theurgy and thaumaturgy and natural magic all the time, right? Most people want that to be what they're doing. But you're always going to have some people who don't think you're doing that, especially in a modern time when we don't really have these distinctions, right? Like everyone who practices magic is all called the same thing, right? We're either a witch or an occultist, and these terms have gotten so broad that they've kind of lost their original meaning. Like what is what, who is what, it's so complicated. But I think knowing where we actually fall in our personal practice, or at least where we believe we fall based on contemplation, is really important because our philosophy is going to guide us and show us our path, right? And show us where to go. Because the big problem in modern Western esotericism is that a lot of people don't know what their path is, where their goals are, and what they actually stand for. What are you doing magic for, and why does all that matter to you? And what is your path? What is your goals? These are all questions we should constantly be asking. And so I think these distinctions are really good food for thought to see what our predecessors saw and what our predecessors viewed as good and bad. Because the truth is, not all magical and spiritual practice is created equally. It is not all great for you, and it is not all terrible for you, right? There is nuance to this. And I think looking into the nuance and breaking it down is really important so that we can all follow a virtuous path that makes sense for us and that suits us. All right, so this has been my video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. This channel is supported through Patreon. Patreon really, really helps. If you join Patreon, you get an extra video every single month. You get early access to these videos. You get my ritual guides, which are over 20 pages of rituals that I have written just for you to follow along with. No Goetia in them. No bad magic. It's funny to say it like that. I guess, yeah, it's the good stuff. It's what I do. So I think it's okay. If I do it, I definitely don't think it's bad for you. And you get, if you're a high enough tier to meet with me once a month, I give private 30-minute consultations to talk about your spiritual practice, answer your questions, and help you grow. So yeah, check out my Patreon. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Telegram, X, Substack, Threads. I'm on all the things. There's really nowhere I'm not. Some places I'm more active than others, but I'm fundamentally everywhere. So thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you subscribe for 93 days, you will meet your Hall Guardian Angel, and you will never need to watch one of these videos again. And perhaps your bangs will behave, and Venus retrograde won't attack your bangs. All right, bye.